The first comic books in the world weren't Superman or Batman or some other form of brilliant independent treatise on human nature or life. The first comic books in the world were crappy, poorly made, mafia-distributed pornographic comics called 8-pagers or Tijuana Bibles. And today we're going to account for exactly what they had to do with the emergence of comics art as we now know it.
It's your birthday. Happy birthday. It's your birthday. Happy birthday. It's a great day. That's what we say. Happy birthday to you.
So before we jump too deeply into our analysis of the Tijuana Bibles, let's cover our material from McLeod in order to give us a little bit of a foundational tool set by which we can approach these comics. Something to do better than, look, Donald Duck having sex. So, the first thing to note from McLeod's work is the concept of a critical language in comics, something that McLeod provided us with in 1993. Prior to that, we really didn't have any academic tools by which to approach comic books. McLeod's work set a standard, a new benchmark through which we could start to actually study comics. As such, it's become enduring. It is very strange, for example, to be using a 1993 textbook in 2020, but here we are. It's just that foundational. So the first thing to cover is McLeod's definition for comics, what it means, and more specifically, what it means to us. For McLeod, comics are, quote, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response within the viewer. So sequential art is the term that has often come out of this definition as a way to describe comics. The main thing is the idea of image juxtaposition, the notion that you have multiple images operating simultaneously. We have this in fine arts, like a triptych would be a pretty simple example of this, but here we can extend the narrative indefinitely, creating comics with 64 panels, easily, all devoted to the same singular purpose, at least in the macro sense. And then the other portion of McLeod's definition, intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, is basically standard for any communications medium that also has artistic potential. So comics can inform us, they can entertain us, they can inspire us. Doesn't really matter. Also of importance, however, is the concept of deliberate sequence. It has to be intentional. There are many examples of books, you might have gotten some at the Scholastic Book Fair, where you can flip different pages together in order to create a new monster or something, where one page covers the head, one page the tail, and one page the body interchangeably. There's even poetry experiments doing the exact same thing. For McLeod, that doesn't work. It has to be deliberate. Now, one thing to note is a famous point of contradiction in McLeod's theory that we'll encounter later on in the course. McLeod will later argue that cartooning, as he calls it, but comics basically, can simulate time effects within single panels. That is to say, a single panel image can be a comic. It doesn't have to be juxtaposed with other images. And that's genuinely problematic. There are no shortage of brilliant single-page comics works out there, including, for example, many great Calvin and Hobbes comic strips that are just single image. Under McLeod's definition and the sort of strict way it lays itself out here, that doesn't apply. So we need to be kind of maybe a little bit more open-minded than McLeod is in his initial definition. So let's move to a more complicated theory. McLeod argues that comics work very similar to how language works. In fact, he positions them within the same spectrum. This is a really important development in terms of opening comic studies up to literary analysis, by suggesting that they are, within the same realm and therefore can be subjected to the same tools that we've cultivated over centuries for conducting literary analysis and tools that we'll frankly employ today on our 8-pagers. McLeod suggests that the spectrum moves in terms of abstraction versus embodiment. So on the far extreme left, what you see is a photorealistic face. And then you go further and further right, and you get more and more and more abstract. And this leads to, as I said, embodiment. What he means by this is, if I look at the face on the left, I can clearly tell that it's not me. and therefore it's harder for me to identify with it. If I move, quite a few spaces to the right, I eventually get to a point where I'm like, okay, that could be me. So photorealism limits the reader's ability to identify, whereas abstract visual representation allows for more readers to identify with a particular image. For our purposes in studying sexuality, this is going to become highly relevant, especially around the concept of gender and the ways that comics can communicate gender, sometimes problematically, and maybe sex as well, since unfortunately we are looking at comics where they very much show the physical attributes. So we'll engage with that as it kind of comes up. The greater point here is that language is a further extreme of abstraction, that a picture of a smiley face is abstract, but the word face is more abstract, that a description of a face, 2 eyes, 1 nose, 1 mouth, is even more abstract, and full-on Shakespeare, that youth's proud livery so gazed on now, is even more abstract. So in this sense, comics again exist within the same spectrum as language and can be analyzed using the same tools. But this also speaks to comics' unique ability to create identification and embodiment, and what that's going to mean in terms of sexual attributes, sex roles, throughout our study is going to become relevant as we sort of muck through it. Now, making this even more complicated, MacLeod comes up with this concept of the pyramid, as he calls it. It's strangely easier to think of it as a triangle, but he wanted it to be three-dimensional. So what you can see in the pyramid shape is that you have the visual representation on one side of the pyramid, and on the other side of the pyramid you have language. The other 2 sides of the pyramid, or one side depending on what we're dealing with here, are not represented. And that's kind of a problem again. So let's focus on triangulation, on looking at this thing as a triangle, because we're going to ignore the language component for now. Let's focus on the stuff that we're not really trained to analyze. So for MacLeod, you have these things operating on a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. The horizontal axis is simple. It's what we just covered. It's the idea that the further left you go, the more photorealistic you are. The further right you go, the more cartoonish you are. But that's only one point of differentiation in comics visual artistry. The other point is the vertical axis. The vertical axis covers what he refers to in his text as non-iconic abstraction, which is the extent to which the cartoon incorporates elements that are not there to represent reality, if that makes sense. So the further up you go, the more metaphorical the image is. So what I mean by this is I can draw different things, right? I can draw a character who's angry by looking at a picture of an angry person and seeing how the lines are going to crease on their forehead and how their brow is going to come down a little bit, and I can try to represent that. Or I can put steam coming out of their ears. Now, one of those things is based on reality, an actual perception of how people look when they're angry, and the other is based on something purely metaphorical. Human beings don't have steam coming out of their ears when they're actually upset. Now, if I'm using the steam coming out of the ears method, I'm going way up that vertical axis. I am incorporating visual elements that have nothing to do with the reality of the thing that I am representing. And in that, I am creating non-iconic abstraction. So if you look at MacLeod's triangle, you can see this pretty clearly. Again, left to right on the bottom there is just realism, photorealism versus cartoonishness. But the vertical axis is where the images start to incorporate things that are not based on representing reality, but are visual flourishes or embellishments intended to convey some aspect of, say, character, something non-corporeal, in order to enhance the story in some way, or in order to carry a sort of symbolic message in some way. And that's really the core of it. So if we look at particular cartoon characters, we can actually place them on this axis, and maybe this would be a useful exercise for you. So if we look at Eric Cartman, how photorealistic is he? Not at all. So he's very far to the right. He's over in Tintin, Mickey Mouse, Bone territory there. And then the second question is just how many elements of his visualization are based on real representation of who he is, and how many are based on sort of metaphorical ones. And you can look at things like the fact that he doesn't have a neck, the fact that his eyebrows are actually on top of his toque somehow, and the general proportion of his body, and say that there's a lot happening there that is not based on real representation of a third grader. As a result, he has to go way up high on that axis. So Cartman lands to the right and north, I guess. I shouldn't mix my metaphors like that. Topish. And then we look at somebody like the Boondocks characters, who are also very cartoonish and go pretty far to the right. but don't have as much visual distortion as Cartman has. Their proportions are slightly inhuman, their hair being a good example of that. And as a result of that, they go a little bit high up, but not all the way up to the extent that Eric Cartman goes. And then we look at somebody like Marv from Sin City, this charming fellow holding a hacksaw and a human head. He's actually pretty photorealistic. Like the lines and all that are meant to represent a human being, but elements of his face are clearly distorted beyond natural human anatomy. And there's a sort of symbolic element to that as well. So Marv goes pretty far to the left and a little bit up, not necessarily too far. Now, the reason this is a triangle as opposed to a square is because of the fact that the more photorealistic you are, the less abstraction you can actually create. So the shape of McLeod's chart actually gives us some insight into how these two axes intersect and how they interact. To the point that if you are going to be super duper 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 non-iconic abstraction and abstract stuff, you actually can't move that far left or right. You're already in kind of this weird liminal space. So this is the triangle. I hope it makes a lot of sense. I know it's a confusing concept to start us out with, but it is really essential to the kind of things that we're going to be analyzing throughout this course, which is, why did these comics artists make the choices that they made? All art boils down to that in its analysis. What were the choices that were made? How would this be different if it was represented a different way? And the triangle gives us a good, again, tool set by which we can look at how photorealistic is this character and why? How abstract is this character and why? What attributes of them are abstract and non-iconic? And what do they therefore accomplish by being those things? Okay, so a little bit of history on Tijuana Bibles. They were commonly known as 8-pagers, sort of interchangeably. I don't think one title was more popular than the other at any point in time. You see them discussed as either Tijuana Bibles or 8-pagers in critical works on the subject. They were created and published entirely through clandestine means. What I mean by that was these are very illegal. They were purchased largely through shops, like under the counter kind of thing. We even see some cool representations of this in media. We also know that they were distributed by the mafia. Will Eisner was once offered a job drawing 8-pagers by, quote, a mob type straight out of Damon Runyon, complete with pinky ring, broken nose, black shirt, and white tie, who claimed to have exclusive distribution rights for all Brooklyn, end quote. Will Eisner is one of the greatest comics artists of all time. So him being kind of recruited reflects other aspects of the culture that we'll talk about in a second here. The title is a misnomer. This is kind of legendary. 8-pagers is accurate. They were 8 pages long, as you'll see, or have seen. Tijuana Bibles, however, was a rather brilliant red herring. They didn't come from Tijuana. Nothing about them had anything to do with Tijuana. They just called them Tijuana Bibles to throw the feds off. So you had people searching Tijuana for printing presses that were making illicit pornography that did not exist. Everything we know tells us they were actually printed out of Manhattan. Then there's historic precedent. I sort of led with this in the intro, but we can talk about this in greater depth. Tijuana Bibles are the first comic books. That's huge in terms of the evolution of this medium. We started out with comic strips as early as 1896 in North America, and if we allow some precursors, even before that. But what we think of as like the sort of current comics media, the comics form, that comes from newspaper comic strips in America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Comic books don't come out until about the 1930s, and at first they were actually just anthologies. So they were like, think like a Calvin and Hobbes book, where you would buy a whole bunch of Calvin and Hobbes strips in one book. They were that. We didn't actually get to extended book-length stories until the late 30s for comic books, and we had Tijuana Bibles as early as the 1920s. So this is a huge precedent for the medium. This is also entirely consistent with the history of most visual media. It's a very strange, maybe not that unintuitive human phenomenon, where as soon as we figure out that we can represent something visually, our immediate reaction is to make porn out of it. Very true of film, photography. You can go right down the list. The history of media, in some ways, is the history of human sexuality, rendered in one form or another. We'll maybe get to talk about that later on in the course as well as we keep going. Now, the term I have here, double dipping through pseudonyms. What I mean by this is comics artists didn't make a lot of money. It was very often sweatshop conditions. And as a result of that, we very frequently had comics artists taking side gigs, sometimes doing pornographic versions of their own characters. And I mean, again, this was clandestine, so we don't have a good history of it, but we have examples such as Eisner's and a few others. Joe Shuster is a great example. We know for a fact that he was doing fetish comics based on his Superman characters, like exact same visualizations by the same artist. What I mean by this is that when we look at these 8-pagers, it is entirely possible it's created by some random artist, or it's entirely possible that the ones that we're looking at are created by the original artist, working under a pseudonym in order to protect their not going to jail factor, essentially. Okay, so let's look at our approach to these things. Critical sexology refers to the academic study of individual sexual practices within a social context. We're going to draw from that a little bit. Literary criticism, as well as cultural and media studies, performs close analysis of a text in order to locate patterns of representation and their relationship to a specific social context, sometimes called pragmatics. Note that the context is fluid. So we can study what the circumstances were like, what the culture was like when the object was created, so what the writer was going through, where they would likely to have been living, what politics were going on at the time. But we can also study it in terms of the site of reception. What I mean by this is when we study Tijuana Bibles, we don't just have to look at how an audience in the 1920s would react to them. We can very much look at how a class in the 2020s is reacting to them, and that's where your individual perspective is going to become very valuable, especially in our discussion comments. These things still exist, still speak to people, but the people it's speaking to are in a different context at this point in time, and it's important that we account for that a little bit. We can also apply a sexual interpretation to the Tijuana Bibles and draw out ideas, theories, and even conclusions about how these texts affect their readers rhetorically, how they work, when they work, if they work. So this can be simple questions. Again, it usually just comes down to the choices the author is making and the impact that those choices are having upon the reader, what it's doing, essentially. How does it work? What makes one Tijuana Bible better than another? What makes the use of an iconic cartoon character in sexual positions more effective than somebody else's representation of the same character in sexual positions? Is there an art here? What is that art? Uncomfortable questions like that. I thought it was a good place to start our course in kind of an uncomfortable way, not just historically. And then along the exact same lines, we move with the even-handed knowledge that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, as Freud himself informs us. But sometimes it's more than that. And we're not going to find any right answers. We don't even know who wrote these things. So feel free to throw out interpretations, ways that individuals react or might react. Again, I think we're going to get a lot of value out of the discussion forum on this one. Also, and I might have mentioned this before, be cool. Okay, so let's start with Blondie. I don't even know if you guys are familiar with Blondie. It still exists. It's been wildly popular for almost a century now. It's been run by 2 authors. So it was created by Chick Young starting in 1930, still running today with Chick's son taking over after Chick's death in the 1970s. It has spawned a film series and a radio serial, both wildly popular. Blondie is frequently interpreted as a feminist character in comics, within limits, obviously, and particularly within context. But in the 1930s, this was a depiction of a career woman who wanted family as well, who was the intelligent member of her household, the dominant member of her household. Dagwood is very much characterized as sort of bumbling and incompetent. He would die without Blondie in a matter of days. So this was progressive for its time period. It falls into other tropes that we should be aware of, and we can certainly talk about, again, coming back to that, how does it read today factor. Not that I'm guessing a lot of you are reading Blondie these days. So the 8-pager trades on this popularity. That's maybe the most important thing to note, and we'll talk about this in one of our discussion questions as well. Why sexualize these characters? Why not just random made-up characters? Why would you pick something that already exists? The 8-pager that we see here adopts the relationship dynamic, the same as the original characters, but channels it towards a domestic sexual fantasy. This is very much a husband and wife story. The sex that they have is casual, even domestic. They put the kid to bed, then they go have sex, and then presumably fall asleep. So the trappings aren't overly elaborate here, and the symbolism maybe even less so, thus making it a pretty useful place to start. The point is that this is, again, a domestic sexual fantasy. In keeping with that, we actually see procreation woven into part of the sexual fantasy. They're talking about having more children and making more children. And the specific sex acts that they perform on each other are singled out as being not capable of producing that. And thus, it actually becomes a strange form of rebellion for them to be performing oral sex on each other, because they can't make babies that way, as it's stated in the comic. Which is kind of interesting politically in a lot of ways. Again, subverting the dominant cultural notion of what sex was for at the time. So what we see is a sort of form of sexual empowerment emerging out of that sort of domestic constraint, whilst still very much participating with it. Now, as I mentioned, Blondie is known for, in particular, having this sort of inverted gender power dynamic for the time. And we can see this very clearly still manifest in the 8-pager. Blondie and Dagwood, in terms of the relationship. Blondie is in the driver's seat. She is the intelligent one. She is giving the orders for the most part. Again, that's a position of sexual power. Now, at the same time, and we're going to talk about this a lot once we start to get into masculine gaze stuff, we have to ask the same question about the power relationship implicit between Blondie and the reader. To what extent is Blondie made to perform for the masculine gaze versus, I don't know, Dagwood to the same extent? Is Dagwood sexualized the same way Blondie is? Is he performing for the reader the same way Blondie is? Or is there a gender double standard here? I don't know. That's something we can talk about in the discussion forum. And then lastly, we have the pleasure dynamic. This has been discussed extensively, like a lot, in terms of representations of female sexuality in media. In particular, how female sexual pleasure is usually denied in media, or at least given less significance. Most notably, the sort of narrative arc of most forms of pornography involve the man's orgasm being the end of the story, that kind of thing. Here in our 8-pager, Blondie's pleasure is important and seems to be, I don't know, given maybe equal footing to Dagwood's. Again, something that we can talk about. Okay, moving on. Our second text is Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy began in newspapers in 1931 and is also still going today. That series spawned several films, radio serials, comic books, and a movie starring Warren Beatty and Madonna in 1990. Dick Tracy was also heavily influential on something more familiar to you, which would be Batman. Batman detective stories are very much in the Dick Tracy vein. This particular 8-pager focuses on Dick Tracy's masculinity, specifically linked to his virility. The idea being that he is incapable of actually pleasing two women, and gets, I don't know what the word here is, pushed to the side, I guess, in order for them to participate in a lesbian sexual fantasy themselves. That, again, may be more performative than orienting around their pleasure. It also focuses on the corruption of a character named Tess Trueheart, and I'm using corruption in quotation marks here because I am not judging Tess Trueheart's sexuality. Tess Trueheart is a legendary Mary Sue character. For anyone not familiar, a Mary Sue character is just like a perfect, in every possible way, character. Virtuous, wonderful, tremendous. So having Tess be challenged by this random female character in order to, I don't know, let's say degrade herself, at least in the eyes of the context of the story. I don't think she's doing that. That's just how it's presented. Is pretty clearly a sexual fantasy of, again, degrading the pure character, of sexualizing her in a way that would be inconsistent with her character, but her virtue being diminished is clearly a part of the sexual fantasy in this story. Tess's transition to a same-sex physical relationship also opens up the idea of non-binary interpretations of sexuality, the idea that she is bisexual. Again, an essentialist term that I don't like, but the idea that she would engage in sex acts with different sex partners is controversial for the time period and moves very much against essentialist theories of sex that existed in that era. Bisexuality wasn't really a thing in the cultural consciousness. Homosexuality was barely a thing in the cultural consciousness. So we can maybe even read some progressive elements to this story, but that might be highly charitable, again, because of the limitations imposed by their performance to the masculine gaze. And we know this a lot with the representation of female same-sex relationships in media. They are often very much performed for a largely, I would say, heterosexual male gaze. It isn't something that is about their pleasure or their character or their being. It's about something that will be an erotic display based upon dehumanizing and fetishizing those characters for the masculine audience. So whether or not we're pivoting around those ideas is again going to be subjective and something that we can talk about. Even if we're arguing, it's a good place to start in terms of trying to isolate what makes it one thing or the other. Donald Duck has a universal desire. I could talk about this thing forever. The amount of sexual symbols sort of manifesting in this story is really impressive to me for an 8-page story about a duck having sex. Context. Donald Duck was created by Walt Disney Productions in 1934, so very old. He is the most published comics character in the world outside of superheroes, a very impressive feat for, I think, what for us is now a sort of second-tier Disney character. He has appeared in more films than any other Disney character, again, a testament to his enduring popularity. The 8-pager version is a homoerotic fantasy. The title is Universal Desire, which I think is kind of a thing we'll talk about. What we're seeing here largely is the effacement of homosexuality whilst catering to it, something that is very common in the time period. You would have texts that would present homoerotic fantasies for largely, I would say, a latent or closeted homosexual audience. So you would have people who were experiencing same-sex desire wanting to, explore pornography on that subject, but at the same time, their culture teaches them that they can't have those desires. So the text is juggling this tremendously delicate thing of trying to be satisfying to that sort of sexual gaze, whilst at the same time justifying or rationalizing these behaviors. And we see this a lot in the text in kind of tragic ways. The cultural norms of anger and hatred that Donald Duck displays. This is a brutal character inconsistency. Donald Duck was an angry character. That's kind of a thing. But in particular, his hatred of homosexuality. He keeps using the term like pansy to describe the person that he's with. Is somewhat tragic. He's expressing hatred for the acts that he's performing for the sake of his pleasure. There's something, really dark happening there, I would argue. We also have here our first example of anthropomorphism, which is an important literary element in fantasy literature of all forms, not just sexual fantasy, obviously, which is giving human attributes to non-human characters. Here the ducks are rendered with human genitalia, which is strange. Anyone familiar in duck anatomy? They have corkscrew penises, and they work very, very differently. And the illustrator here creates these giant human penises on the ducks. Now, weird as this is, we can actually talk about this in terms of non-iconic abstraction. What we have in this anthropomorphism is a visual element that is not consistent with the reality. So it's fulfilling a symbolic purpose. And in this case, it might be super duper obvious, which is to have us identify with the sexuality of the duck, to see the duck's sexual pleasure as our sexual pleasure, to, again, allow us to enter into that narrative, which I would argue is kind of the point of most of the pornography that we've been looking at today in comics form. I don't know, there's other things here, but I'd rather talk about it in discussion form rather than me just yelling at you my interpretation of duck pornography. So let's move on. Okay, bringing us to a close here, I have 2 discussion questions for you, both briefly mentioned already. 1, why sexualize existing comics characters as the 8-pagers tended to do? Why not just invent your own characters? What's the value of using pre-existing ones and drawing on that audience or that existing world to some extent? And then 2, based on McLeod's observation from the readings this week, how does non-iconic abstraction coincide with eroticism? What is sexy about these comics characters that makes people want to see them having sex instead of, people? What does cartooning have to offer? The sort of erotic gaze that these 8-pagers are clearly catering to. And I will see you in the discussion boards. Sorry about the duck stuff.